Welcome to the Gospel Freedom Podcast. You heard it first as a Twitter space, but for the first time distributed on the major podcast platforms. This is the Gospel Freedom, live, unfiltered, and unedited. Get the raw truth from your host, Mitchell Parker. Enjoy.
I'm not sure how this is going to go. My name's Mitchell Parker, and this is my first ever Twitter space. I'm not sure about how this works, comments and the like, and who's watching, and people listening and whatnot. So I've just decided while I'm walking home, I'll give this a bit of a go, and talk about a few things. WorldPride is that sexual degeneracy. So you have this fake Christianity that held society together with a common set of values, even if people didn't really believe what they were actually professing. The problem with that is that then eventually people stop pretending, and then society collapses. So the title I've given this is WorldPride Comes Before the Fall. And that's quite an interesting idea, because, the saying is pride comes before the fall. And the thing about world pride is that it's not all actually about pride, right? It's about the sexual deviancy of people. And I put in some kind of related topics to this space. I'm not sure who would actually listen to this, but I think it's important that all these things are related, family relationships and whatnot, and this kind of world news as it's world pride. But so it's not even the homosexual agenda. I mean that, again, I've said previously, it's been a trope thrown around at Christians to say, hey, look, well, you just don't like gay marriage, or whatever you want to call it, quote unquote gay marriage. It's an oxymoron to have gay and marriage together. Unless, of course, you mean gay by colourful, bright and colourful, or happy. And most recently, of course, that's really not what most people use the word gay for. They use it. They use the word meaning, practically, as just any form of homosexual behaviour. And then it kind of just became something for homosexual men. But regardless, world pride is that sexual degeneracy, one part. And the second part is that pride. Because it's not only, we want to be tolerated in society, it's that we are proud of our sexual deviancies. And we're going to force it upon you. I mean, we had the Mardi Gras last week. And for American audiences, Mardi Gras is very different in America than it is here. It is here in Australia. It's it's the exact opposite of which are in America, which are the Easter parades. This is a homosexual parade. And I'm not sure, maybe that's where they took the name from, and they said, well, let's take over the name Mardi Gras and make it mean something different. Because I didn't even know there actually wasn't another definition of Mardi Gras until I saw a few years ago. It's like Mardi Gras. You celebrating Mardi Gras? And actually, no. This wasn't a bad thing. This was a Christian festival, a Christian celebration. So I had no idea. I held myself because I'm thinking, well, maybe something different in America. And it was. So it's one part homosexual deviance. The other part is pride, which is as I just said, not only the tolerance, but that everyone must be able to say this is a good thing. And not only that it's good for them, but that it's good for everybody. And so we see this with drag queen story hours. And it's not even a joke, right? The homosexual agenda is no joke. It really is a thing to push sexual deviancies onto children. And you can bury your head in the sand all you want. And I'm not saying any of you listening are. If you actually follow me, if you don't, well, maybe you are. But you can't bury your head in the sand about this issue. That is what it is. Now, I don't know the particulars of exactly what went on, but I know there was a march across the Harbour Bridge. I mean, just as there was a march down Oxford Street. At least I think that's the street they do the Mardi Gras on. But anyway, shut down the city 2 Sundays in a row. On a Sunday night, or Saturday night actually, and then on a Sunday morning the following week. I mean, can you just think back, say, to the 1950s? What were people doing on a Sunday morning? They were going to church. Now, let me just say, a lot of those people who did that weren't really Christians, right? They were nominal Christians, which really doesn't mean anything. You're just not a Christian if you're nominal. And that nominality, although very terrible in terms of actually building up the Christian faith, because lots of people were just pretending, and so you have this fake Christianity. But what it did do was it held society together with a common set of values, even if people didn't really believe what they were actually professing. It held society together. The problem with that is that then eventually people stop pretending, and then society collapses. And so that's what we had with, the 1970s, well, 60s first, and then the 70s, and then the 80s, as far as I understand. I'm not old enough to know. I was born 20 years after the 80s. There was a bit of a pushback during the 70s, late-ish 70s and 80s, because people could see, well, we enforce all these anti-Christian laws, the big three, in regards to homosexuality, abortion, and divorce. And there was a bit of a pushback, as far as I can tell, or it just seems that way, at least politically speaking. It seems that in America you had, obviously, Ronald Reagan. In the UK you had a whole decade almost of the 80s with Margaret Thatcher, who, whilst not probably as socially conservative, if I want to use that label, as people think. If you watch her Sermon on the Mount, as people called it, because, even in that day, there were the which I didn't quite realise, there were the socially liberal fake Christians within the Anglican Church of England, right, who were, and other politicians undermining her, saying, oh, what is she doing making this seemingly political speech at a church, the church in Scotland, the Mound, which I believe is the main part of the Scottish Church, or the headquarters, or whatever you call it. I'm not exactly sure too much on that because I'm obviously British. But, that place is called the Mound. And obviously sort of relating it to the Sermon on the Mount with the T and a D with Jesus. And so there was just sort of this mocking comparison. Like even in her day, there were those people who wanted to dismiss people like Margaret Thatcher. And if you watch that speech, which I have, because at one point last year, I was reading up a few things and, read the Sermon on the Mount, and then I watched her speech, and absolutely everything she says in there I agree with. And 100% of what she says is biblical. And people were dismissing that, even back then in the 80s, which is astounding to me. But I can see truly how far things have fallen. But even then, they were trying, like the collectivist anti-Christian forces in the various institutions, they were trying to undermine that. And one of the things that Margaret Thatcher did was, I think, she brought in a law, which I don't know what they call in Russia, they call homophobic. Some law which as far as I understand, some section that prohibited, as far as I know, the promotion of homosexuality. I'm not sure exactly how far it went or whatever, but lots of people, they don't like that. You know, lots of so-called conservatives, right? Because not really conservatives. First of all, because they're not conserving anything, but also they don't have an absolute moral basis as Christianity. And so they're trying to tarnish Margaret Thatcher on that. The point is that what I was saying was that back in the 80s, there was definitely a pushback against what happened in the 60s and 70s, certainly in the first half. Now, Australia didn't really have a socially conservative government, but the two major English-speaking powers did. So it wasn't quite the same. We did have a Labour government, which was rather not necessarily socially conservative really at all, but it was definitely not a radical left-wing government, you know, the government led by Bob Hawke. So whilst it wasn't the traditional conservative way, I think people saw that the Liberal Party, the equivalent of the Conservative and Republican Party here in Australia, was pretty much inept at governing. And they thought a good Aussie bloke, good quote unquote, like Bob Hawke, was a good choice because he was the typical Australian man. Right? He loved a good beer, he loved the unions, he was a real people person, he had some mistresses, he obviously loved lots of women, if you want to call it love. And so there was that. And so you might say, well, Mitchell, that's not the same. Might not be. But it was definitely a pushback against, from what I understand, I'm not an expert in political history, against the Liberal government, which was quite, you know, I want to use an old phrase, hoity-toity. You know, this quite upper class, aristocratic feel. You know, it's all pro-business. And I think that's the thing that's happened, you know, in the shift in politics, is that what we understand as the right has become the individual parties of the right have become the parties of the working class and of the traditional family values. And you could say that was evident in Labour. At that point in Australia with Bob Hawke, it was still of that, you know, lower working class mindset. You couldn't quite say that about the previous Labour government of Gough Whitlam, which was quite socialist. The things chop and change. But the point is that in the 50s, you know, we wouldn't have had that kind of perverse showing of homosexuality on a Sunday morning. You know, that would be disgusting. It's disgusting. But now look at what things have happened. And the point is that pride comes before the fall. And if you look at Rome, and I'm not necessarily going to name and shame, but my father, who's very much left-wing, very much woke, if you want to call it that, traditionally Labour woke, right? Even he can see the West crumbling like the Romans had. And so, you know, we can see the different things happening. Now, he has a different solution to that. And it's quite different. And also quite similar in how we view things. So he has a different approach, but we see things pretty much the same. And in his way of dealing with things is seemingly more centralisation, but like the right centralisation of power, as if that can ever be achieved. But he sees it, yeah, he wants things that push us further towards the precipice. But, you know, it comes down to one of the things that I often say, which is that the woke, if they're not 100% ideological, and that's all they'll do, then they're actually more able of convincing than, say, the NPCs or the sheeple or whatever you want to call them. The people that are part of the mass formation psychosis, that they do whatever the institutions say of them. Whether that be a church group or other religious group or the government, whoever is pushing the agenda on them, or multiple institutions, they follow it. And so the work, if they're open to facts, like my father is, in some sense, you can show him Ukraine and you can show him, well, there actually are some Nazis in Ukraine. And that isn't actually justification for what Putin is doing. That's not to say that either side are blameless. In fact, both of them are participating in a charade to screw the West out of millions of dollars, billions now, for funding the rich oligarchs. That, you don't need to be conspiracy theorists about this. You just point to the facts. That's what I try and do also. Is I don't need to be like, oh, look, and Bill Gates and them, and look at all them, and they're doing this and that. You just go to the facts, and the facts speak louder than your conspiracies. It's also the conspiracies can be very entertaining and some of them possibly true. If we just say, look, at Zelensky and all the people turning up to our quote-unquote war zone, right? Well, how many of these celebrities did you see go into Iraq or to Afghanistan or to Syria? Where did you see them appear? Where was George Clooney, crying out for, say, even the Iranians? I'm pretty sure his wife's Iranian, or is she Pakistani or something? Anyway, where do we see these people come and fall at the altar of the people that they claim to love? They all say that the white people are racist, yet all they seem to do is love the white Ukrainians, many of whom are Nazis. I'm not saying everyone Ukraine's a Nazi. Maybe I said many, it's probably not the right word, but a substantial proportion of them are Nazis. To actually become a substantial reason why Putin will have this justification. Anyway, the point is that you can show people the facts, and they can see, well, things are actually falling apart. And whilst the work might not actually realise, well, that's because of our policies. They can see that things are falling apart. But what's happening with the Romans is you had, right before the end, it was almost a parody of the earlier Roman Empire. You had these grand gladiator conquests. Essentially, if you want to call them conquests. You threw in the weak, you threw in prisoners, and you threw in Christians, and you added a couple of lions for good measure. And things were very entertaining, and you gave them bread. And the phrase is bread and circuses, and we can see the same thing here. It's a ramped up parody of the West. The kindness and the tolerance of the West, but on steroids. So kind and tolerant that you're neither kind nor tolerant. And that's the hilarity and the parody in all this, is that none of what the West is doing is kind or tolerant. And coming back to the pride thing, it's, there is no tolerance here. Where is the Christian pride event? Where have we seen a Christian or even remotely Christian-like event since, I would say, 2008 with, what was it, World Youth Day, Catholic Youth Day, where the then Pope came to Australia? When can we say anything like that? And so that's what you have to think about, is it's been a good 10 years since we've seen any of, the pro-Christian agenda being pushed. And in fact, it had ended basically about then anyway, because that's when the narrative seemed to push to change the definition of marriage. Because up until then, even people in the Labour Party were saying that the marriage issue was settled. It was, oh, this is just settled, guys. Like, of course, marriage is between a man and a woman. And I'm sure the Democrats saying the same thing, and the UK Labour as well. And so we can just see that, some people want to call it the slippery slope fallacy. There's certainly no fallacy. It's not quite a slippery slope. Let me explain. it's not actually about the slope, it's about the premise. And the premise is this. The premise is the Word of God is irrelevant. It's not a book to use to guide our moral values in society. And so what do you end up with? You end up with WorldPride. You end up with the promotion of drag queen story hours and other abominations. But you start with the small things that people tend to agree on, right? And so that's why it seems like a slippery slope, because this seems to then cause this. Even though they could have gone from 0 to 100, they don't, because that's not how these ideologies work. You can't substantially change a society's culture without a just cause, or seemingly just. The so-called COVID-19 pandemic, which is more of a pandemic of so-called vaccines than it was of an actual disease. In fact, the disease was fairly mild. And sure, whilst so-called COVID-19, if you want to call it that, whatever came out of the lab in Wuhan, certainly killed some people, it was no more deadly than anything else. And that was sort of the point of it coming out, was it was this unknown, right? And so you use fear to control the unknown. And that's how you substantially change society. You have society more and more bent, it's going to be frequently more bent, but more and more bent to the woke agenda pre-2020, and then you just snap it. And then BLM comes, especially through America and the UK, and they're marching, and suddenly no one cares about this virus, except for when it's those dirty Republican anti-lockdown protests, right? And then that sort of fades away when, of course, who so-called wins the election? It's only the House Plan-in-Chief, Joe Biden, and his incompetent Vice President, Kamala Harris. Oh, they're appointed as the President and Vice President of America, and suddenly Antifa, who Joe Biden declared it was just an idea, suddenly becomes an idea again and promptly disappears. You know, if in some crazy world that Donald Trump was actually allowed to win that election, whether he was robbed of the election due to the media, or eventually the media was not enough and that they needed some other nefarious tool to make Joe Biden win, such as manipulating ballot counts. Whether they did that or the media, I don't think it really matters too much, because I think they're both as equal. They're both lies. Either if you lie with the ballot count or you lie with the media to the same end. I think if you have the same intention and the same end, and they're both as wrong. But if Donald Trump was allowed to win, imagine the riots that would have taken place. You know, Antifa would suddenly, once again, stop becoming an idea and being reality. And you would have seen riots like you never would have seen, and we still remember the guards and the shops that were shutting down all around Washington, D.C., because there were mobs ready. Should Donald Trump, in some world, be allowed to win? And he wasn't allowed to win. Whether that's because he's controlled opposition and he was told, have your 4 years off and come back as the saviour in 4 years' time, essentially, or whether he really was pushed out because he knew too much and he had to go. Or he was about to fire Fauci and fire all these people who had cooked up this virus in the lab, who then cooked up the so-called vaccine to then kill some people. Of course, not everyone, because that would be way too suspicious. Once again, you need a so-called just cause to snap people. But what you do is you snap at those people with lockdown. And then it's just, from then on, I don't know if you noticed, but since lockdown has ended, which was the always news, we always have a week, every single week, especially since I've been back on Twitter, you would have seen my post. But in between that time when I was virtually suspended last year for calling the jabs genocide, and now I'm back. Hopefully it was thanks to the new Elon Musk team that, were hopefully, I didn't see it initially, getting rid of all the virtual suspensions of people who actually had their account not actually suspended, because no one had actually reviewed the appeal to the initial suspension. And of course, if they don't review it, well, what happens? You can't tweet or do anything. But yeah, it just seems that every week there's one or two news stories, and occasionally there's also an ongoing story for a month. It just dominates things, so that there's always something for either us, I like to call freedom people, I like the word truther, sounds quite conspiratorial, so that we and the NPCs are distracted for another week. Meanwhile, there's lots of hearings, for example, in the US Congress, about various things. And then we've had this past week, we've had leaks of WhatsApp messages with UK ministers, which prove what we already know. They said, when are we going to, what did Matt Hancock say, release the new variant? Now, whether that means he's actually going to release a variant and say, well, here is a variant, whether that means make one up and pretend there's a variant, or whether that just means announce that there is a new variant, either way, it's nefarious either way. Either of those several ways, or combination of them, because you're using it for a political means. And so the point is that every week there's something new, and whether this is a distraction from the fact that these people knew far more than even these messages say, because obviously they had meetings in person. We know about lockdown, the Partygate, we're going to call it that, or those lockdown parties, but everyone else is shut up in the UK. They got to have their parties and their alcohol and their food. No masks, because we all know masks don't work. With regards to COVID-19, I'm not saying masks actually don't work for some actual purpose. For example, obviously breathing masks you need when you're doing carpentry or marbling, that sort of thing. And obviously, masks when you're in theatre. And I mean, that kind of theatre, performance, that kind of mask, yes. Yes, I saw that over COVID-19. Or performance mask, not that. Actual theatre, and also medical theatre as well. We saw all of that. So let me gather my thoughts and pick up in a moment and try and wrap things up. Doesn't really home. Yes, I'll finish off about the masks. Now, they were not only a theatre, but yes, people need them actual medical theatre and protecting. As Fauci would say, he's my one impersonation of Fauci. The droplets, the droplets could infect, vulnerable patients for having surgery put on them. But yeah, no party, no mask in these parties and whatnot. So no, they're talking in person. And so these are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, they don't say, well, actually, we do know a lot more. I mean, I don't know how many of these people get, the direct orders from, it's not one person, but from the group of people who are clearly controlling the agenda, right? Whether Matt Hancock actually is just a useless dude, or whether he's actually more nefarious. Either he knew something, which is the disappointing thing, is it's not the total conclusive proof that we sort of wanted. And we know that they know more than this. Problem is that it makes you think, well, how much did he really know? Because you see this and more, it's clear that he's operating under some assumption there are some external factors. It's not just all them controlling the narrative. right? So someone's giving orders. Um, you know, maybe this actually was the, I don't know, if you want to call it unhappy coincidence of a series of just well-connected globalists who came upon something that someone else was using, and one person got a message, and it just became to this Chinese whispers. That it's such a web that we don't actually know who's controlling what, because everything's so well designed that a piece of information leaks out, but it's never the whole truth. But even if we say that, well, only Boris Johnson really knew, say the Prime Minister or President in whatever country, only they really knew what was going on. And only they knew something. And, that was the point, was they were not meant to know everything, because eventually these people could break and say things. So obviously they weren't going to be told everything. But the releasing the variant, either way, they knew something. And it's not making news. I mean, the guy was sacked, or he resigned, because he was having an affair, right? It was caught, that he was, kissing the woman he was having an affair with on CCTV, and it was revealed, and actually he resigned and got sacked or whatever. But Matt Hancock, that is, I'm talking about, the UK health minister, then health minister. And that's the hilarious thing, is that these people can sort of do that and sort of move on. And one of the funny things that I was going to sort of mention with the cabal, just in closing, is that George Osborne, former UK Chancellor, which is what we call a treasurer in the UK and in Australia and US, he was then editor of, was it the Evening Standard, right? And then he obviously moved on, when he was moved on from politics, moved on from the Standard. And then it was David Cameron, former UK Prime Minister's sister-in-law, who then becomes the editor. I mean, these people, like I said, you don't even have to make that nefarious. They're all this really evil group of people, and they're getting orders from one evil person, like Klaus Schwab, who obviously he's not obviously the only one. But even just the cabal of people who just control things, just from the highest echelons, particularly British society, where they all go to Eton and Oxford and whatnot, and and they control everything. And it's just hilarious that, and kind of sad that the job gets passed from George Osborne, then to David Cameron, who was his Prime Minister during his time as Chancellor. So that's very interesting. Not exactly sure where I was going with this. I remember. It's just there's always something else, because once society's broken, the controlled populace needs something to control themselves with it, and nothing is more controlling than another overriding agenda. Because you've got the weekly, news stories and daily ones. It's always something, and weekly. And then you have your agendas. You have your carbon climate cult, and you have your COVID cult, and you have your homosexual agenda, and the Ukraine agenda, and all that. This is just another one of those things. But we can all see that this has all become a parody of the tolerant West. And when it comes down to it, society's crumbling. Who's doing well? China. And also the Islamic world, and Russia. And even though they don't have democracy, they have consistent values which they stick by. They don't change a few things. And so we all know things are getting worse, and there are lots of Christians who will say, oh, no, things are getting better, because they take a different view of the end times. Well, actually, I think this is pretty clear. Things are getting worse. And this Pride, instead of World Youth Day with Catholicism, which I disagree with on many fronts, at least Christianity being projected, instead of having World Youth, World Pride. Not just the sin of pride, of being proud of degeneracy, but even just the degeneracy itself. Don't know who'll listen to this. Don't really matter. This is a bit of a test, bit of fun, and hopefully if you do listen to this at some point, you'll enjoy it. But anyway, thank you for listening. Goodbye, and God bless.